One of the things I think is important is that racism is a slippery term, right? Because it's both an attitude and an action. And so on the one hand, you could say, okay, racism is a discriminatory attitude of assuming superiority and inferiority. But legally, racism is really hard to prove because you have to demonstrate intent. You have to demonstrate that people purposely wanted to harm somebody else because they were discriminating against them. When we talk about environmental racism, we usually step back a little from that intention level and talk more about effects. So if we have social systems that create the circumstances in which some people are going to be affected because they're more exposed to chemicals or they're more exposed to pollution than others, then the system actually is racist. So we can say that there's systemic racism, even if the intent of the people who are implementing the regulations or applying for permits to build a plant is not overtly racist. So it's an important distinction to make. And then environmental justice you can think of as the goal we'd like to attain in some ways. Environmental justice is a prescriptive term rather than a descriptive term in some ways. It's how things ought to be. They ought to be just so that everybody is protected from environmental harms and everybody has equal access to environmental benefits. So two ways I talk about environmental justice in my class, well, three. One is there's what we call the disproportionate exposures. So we can talk about distributive justice issues. Who is more likely to be breathing polluted air? Who is more likely to not have access to clean water? Who is less likely to have access to fresh produce and full service grocery stores? And so that's a disproportionate exposure, also disproportionate access to benefits, like whose neighborhood has the nicest parks, whose neighborhood has the schools with really nice grounds and facilities. But then the other part of it is who had a voice in the process, who had actual influence on the process of deciding where the Marathon refinery was going to be located or whether they could expand it, who got to decide whether there would be paper packaging plants next to their neighborhood or where the 131 business loop would be running through which neighborhood in Kalamazoo. So we can also talk about procedural justice, who has a meaningful role or an actual voice in the processes or the procedures through which we decide where our environmental bads and our environmental goods will get located in our society. And then a third concept really related to that comes up is the idea of recognition justice. It's like who gets recognized as having a voice that should be listened to or issues that should be addressed. And all of those come back to what David brought up, this issue of power. Who actually has a voice and has power in our social systems.
That was great. Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
I just want to add a couple of things that to cut right through to the heart of it. And so these are things from Ben Chavez. I mentioned him earlier. In 1982 is the first time that we have a record of anyone using the term environmental racism, and it was a term he came up with. He was not at the time, but he would become president of the NAACP. Some key concepts. This is some of the things Sybil was talking about. It is conscious or unconscious, intended or unintended, and that's important because it doesn't matter if you intend to cause environmental racism. It only matters if you do it. So that's a big. And then a good way, the way that he defined it back in '82, he said it's the uneven enforcement of environmental law between people of color communities and white communities. And I think that that's just a really short, to the point description.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. So kind of going off what you guys just said, what would qualify then? Is there a definition, or is there a specific way that we can qualify an environmental injustice or an environmental justice issue?
Well, the EPA's actually set some formal standards because they actually have so back in 1992, Bill Clinton issued an order saying that the government should actually look at environmental justice issues when thinking about any new project that the federal government would be funding. And so the Department of Transportation, if they want to run a highway somewhere or build a bridge or expand a road, they have to consider who are the communities likely to be impacted, as an example. So then the question is, well, how do you define whether it's an environmental justice issue? Because, categories, right? And so the EPA has metrics that have to do with, so that gets complicated. It's like, okay, you're going to take the percentage of minorities within the state and then compare that to the percentage of minorities in the community that's going to be affected by this process. And if it exceeds a certain number, like it's 50%, whereas in the state, the minority population is only 12%, then you've got such a disparity that this has the potential to be an environmental justice issue where people of color are being affected disproportionately. But they also have a category that is just based on exposures. And so regardless of race, if a particular community is being exposed to like 12 or more toxic facilities, which is true in Southeast Michigan, then it doesn't matter what your race is. You've got an unjust burden there. And so it's either by the quantity of exposure or it's by the racial makeup of the community and how that relates to the patterns of the overall state demographics.
And I'd love to add a follow-up question to that. When did the EPA officially make those guidelines?
That's a good question. So they got the executive order in 92.
Dumping in Dixie?
What?
Was it after that Dumping in Dixie book?
Yeah, but I'm trying to think, because I know that Michigan was using those standards when they developed the draft environmental justice plan under Granholm. So they've been around for a little while. But I'm not sure exactly when those were institutionalized. The EPA actually has an environmental justice advisory council that helps them develop these plans and includes representation from environmental justice activist groups and the indigenous tribes.
Yeah, it was either 85 or 88 when the federal government first recognized that it was real. But I don't know when they set standards. So I would think a little bit broader. So Sybil was right. I mean, that's absolutely the way to think about it. But I think of it as, okay, first, what is environment? Yeah, it's everything around you, the air you breathe, the water you drink, the shelter you're in, all of it. Everything is environment all the time. And then think of, what is race consist of? So if we want environment and race, so think about environmental racism. And the way I would describe it is what qualifies as environmental justice issue is if I would choose not to live somewhere because I don't like the environmental conditions that exist, because I would have the option to live someplace else. So if other people live there and don't have an option to move someplace that is cleaner or quieter or prettier or whatever their environmental issue is, that's environmental injustice. And if race is a factor in that, then it's environmental racism.
Thank you. That was a really good explanation. So we've talked about.
There's this wonderful comment that some environmental justice communities will say is like, okay, you want to put this facility here and you're telling us it's really wonderful, then how come the white people aren't trying to get it in their neighborhood instead?
So you guys mentioned some dates when the EPA actually signed the stuff, Dumping in Dixie, which I know was in the 80s. Where does the environmental justice movement have its roots in United States history? Was it more or less a spark, or was it a gradual formation? And when you're looking at the environmental justice movement, how does that kind of align with the history of environmental racism in the United States? I know that's like a 4-part question though.
Well, when you're talking about the movement, and we often talk about the spark being 1982 in North Carolina, because that's when you had this case where in Warren County, when they wanted to build a landfill to dispose of PCBs, the community protested, and Ben Chavis and other civil rights activists came and joined in those protests and got a lot of national media attention, which then led to doing some research and recognizing this was not a one-off. This was not something that only was happening in this community, and it was not even only happening in the South. That when they did an analysis, and Ben Chavis, this was before he worked for the NAACP, it's when he was working for the United Church of Christ, which had a commission on social justice. And they did an analysis of where the toxic waste facilities were for the entire nation, and discovered that the single biggest predictor of where they'd end up was the racial composition of the community. And then the second predictor was income. So at that point you say, okay, this is not just local politics or an accident. This is a system. So what's wrong with the regulations? Why is this happening? And so that's often treated as the point at which we can say a movement began, because there was evidence and there was a coalition and there was the building of activism all across the country, where all of these separate groups that had been reacting to local things started saying, oh, wait, we need to join forces and work together. And so then out of that, you get things like the summit meeting, where people of color gather in Washington, D.C. to talk about the issues that are happening all over the country. And suddenly people are not treating this as just a local event, but rather as a national movement. But if you talk about the issues, they go all the way back, because I'm sure the history class covers things like when we get cholera epidemics and suddenly, they're fencing off Chinatown in San Francisco, or deciding that the Chinese citizens can only live in certain areas of the city because they're diseased, and so they have to be kept separate in their residential quarters. So we've got environmental justice that goes all the way back to the beginnings of the United States, and even beforehand.
Yeah, and that's where I'm going to go with this question. I know it kind of this is where we are heading next, but so looking at where environmental racism starts helps us to understand where the environmental justice movement starts. And frankly, when it comes down to it, the United States from day one has been a racist country and has been promoting environmental racism from the very beginning. So if we look at even before the United States is formed, let's look at it as a historian. We look at what can we document with evidence. So that's where I will start. I'm not saying that there was no environmental racism before Europeans arrived, just that we can prove that there is environmental racism when Europeans arrived. And look at the Spanish. When the Spanish first got here, they made Native Americans, indigenous peoples. There's no America really at that point. They made indigenous people work the silver. So they would to extract silver from the ore, they'd powder it or powderize it, mix it with mercury, and then it needed to be macerated. So they'd make Native peoples walk around in that mercury and silver solution in bare feet, which obviously is not a healthy situation. They didn't do it, so it was racially based. Look at British when they first started bringing slaves to work in rice fields because of the tropical diseases that would kill the white settlers. You can track this all the way through, whether it's confining Native Americans onto the worst possible land for reservations, whether it is you look at race and ethnicity combined, you could say the most recent immigrants from Europe in the late 1800s, early 1900s were forced to work in the most dangerous, most inhospitable condition factories. And Black Americans being redlined into being forced to buy, or only being really allowed to buy property in industrial areas and in areas that were more contaminated. This is something that is written into the DNA of the United States. And in Sybil's point that we start to talk about an environmental justice movement in the 1980s because that's when it has a name and that's when it becomes a movement. We don't really talk about it, but that means that we're dismissing the slaves who resisted the conditions they were forced under and tried to push back. Or the Native Americans who were resisting being confined to reservations that were unhealthy. So there's always been environmental justice, but by the 1980s, 1990s, it becomes a recognized movement within the social and activist movements of the United States.
I would love if you guys could expand a little bit on dumping in Dixie, because I know that was a really significant event in the history of this movement, and kind of more or less, what happened and what caused it to peak the way it did, and kind of what was going on in the country at the time that brought so much light to that specific area.
I think that's one you probably spend more time on than I do, David.
Yeah, it's dumping in Dixie. It's the name of a federal report, and that's why it's significant. I believe I'm not sure on the date. It's either 85 or 88. It's mid to late 1980s, and this was the federal report that Sybil was talking about. Where this is a federal report where they studied all of these toxic waste facilities and where they were cited and looked at them against economic and racial factors and demonstrated that, yes, in fact, environmental justice, particularly the citing of hazardous waste facilities, has a racial component. And it's important because that's the point that the federal government really, whether they want to acknowledge it in policy or not, has recognized through an official document that it exists.
So based off of all of that, we have the 80s as kind of like a benchmark for the movement, although, history of the United States, that is environmental racism in and of itself. How would you guys describe the current relationship between the environmental justice movement and the United States today?
As in the United States government?
Yeah, the government.
So it's a stop and start process. So Bill Clinton issues Executive Order 12898 and says, okay, we have to think about environmental justice. The EPA actually develops an office that has as its mission to think about environmental justice issues. And the ideas they develop stay in place through Republican administrations. They just get less used during Republican administrations. And then during the Obama administration, there was more effort in this direction. So it's kind of, it ebbs and flows. Some of the people who do this work, Charles Lee, Mustafa Ali, have been constants through changes of administration. So there's been some continuity in those offices, but they've tried to write regulations so that the different government agencies will think about what they're doing. And then the next step is the government sets something, the states have to do their part. And so most of the states don't yet have an environmental justice plan. New Jersey has a pretty good one. Michigan had a good draft, and then all the people who are working on it had almost completed. They had a draft, and then they realized that Governor Snyder was about to be elected probably. And so the corporate bodies that were part of the development of this plan basically decided not to sign the end result because they figured if a Republican got into office, they didn't have to make any changes for at least 4 years, which is what happened. And then Flint, when we had the Flint crisis, suddenly Governor Snyder decided maybe environmental justice was important. So he reinstated the working group on environmental justice. So and now we actually have a person whose job is to lead environmental justice efforts for the state of Michigan. And this is a first. We've never had a person who was the coordinator before. And we'll probably see reinstatement of some of the good ideas that were in the original plan that never got implemented, like actually having a petition process through which communities that feel that they're suffering an injustice can actually bring that to the state government and say, can you look at this, look into this? And that petition would have to have 50 signatures, half of which have to be local, was the way that was set up, as a way to make sure it's not just one person who's squeaking, it's local people coming in who are attesting that there's something going on. So, it's this stop and start process in terms of creating regulatory structures. But the other side of this is that the activists have become really savvy over the years. So we see communities learning how to take agency and to become voices that can affect the processes. So one of the things that usually happens when we get an environmental justice issue in a community is if the community responds to it, the community becomes stronger, and the community starts to insist on actually having a voice and being heard. And there are places like area code 48217 in Michigan is considered the most polluted area code in the entire state, and it's got terrible air pollution. And so that's a hard one, but in other places, there's real movement going on to make things better. And it helps that we now have so much more accessible knowledge. So any person can actually go to the EPA websites and track the toxic release inventory. The information's online. The EPA has an EJ screen tool where you can actually look at maps of the United States. And the EPA has put out the information where you can actually go in and add filters on a map of, say, Kalamazoo, and you can overlay demographics like income and health issues like asthma with where the toxic releases are, or what the air quality issues are. And that's just public knowledge. So these tools are now available to people that make a real difference.
Yeah, I'll take it in a little bit different direction, because that's a kind of an open question. If you look at, or if you think about all of the things that Sybil just said, they all really fall in kind of the same time frame. And that's one of the things that I want to hit on is, these things we were talking about earlier. Environmental justice as a concept about which most Americans are aware or care didn't really break through until, about 2000 or so. There was, and one of the things that I always reference is there was a short article in 2004 that caused a lot of conflict in the environmental movement. It was called The Death of Environmentalism. And I just loved this article because the author's point, it was two authors that wrote it together, their point was that environmentalism, and as of 2004, had become a special interest. In comparison to, say, in the 1970s when it was at its peak politically. And so politicians and activists would see environment as another box. It's race, it's gender, it's class, it's environment, it's pick your interest or pick your special topic. And the author's point was that as long as environmentalism was seen as one special interest among many, the movement would never have a chance. The only way that environmentalism could drag itself out of a tailspin, and you notice that environmentalism does not have the political clout as that it should. The only way to get out of that tailspin is to recognize that race and environment are deeply intertwined, that gender and environment are deeply intertwined, that healthcare and environment are deeply intertwined. Any topic you think of has to be part of environment. And that's, where environmental justice, that's what that is. It's like we're recognizing that environment's not just saving the polar bears, which are great. We need more polar bears. Let's protect the polar. But if that's what environmentalists are seen as doing, is protecting polar bears and giraffes, a huge portion of the American public has no interest in what you're doing, because they are confronted with environmental hazards on a daily basis, and they can't care about polar bears and giraffes because they need to care about their health. And I think that's important, is that environmental movement has finally realized that environment means people. It means wherever we are at the moment, and we have to protect all of it. We can't just protect the remote, pristine places.
And
one of the things that's been interesting, I use the term eco-justice for my course, and the eco-justice movement actually runs parallel to the environmental justice movement. The eco-justice was what the churches called what they were doing, because the Christians, they never cared about the polar bears. What they cared about was love your neighbor. And so for them, environmental movements were always about what's going on in the community and how do we deal with social injustices. And it's been really fascinating to see in the last few years where because of climate change, the environmental movement has finally come around to saying, oh, there's this big justice thing that we need to connect to. And how do we bring together the big green movements and the social justice movements and forge some sort of alliance moving forward? So there's been this transition that's just happened recently that it's got a lot of energy behind it.
That's all great. Thank you. I appreciate that. I actually didn't know about the eco-justice movement as being different, but in terms of, the specific communities like you guys have been talking about that tend to be attracted to the environmental justice movement, and as that being part of the environmentalist movement, how does that, or I guess, does it relate to specific communities that tend to be the most affected? Or even a better question might be, how pervasive and extensive is environmental racism in the United States?
Well, so they did that study on where the toxic dumps were in 1987, and then they 20 years later went back to look and see how things had improved or not, and it was even worse. And what Paul Mohai, who was one of the authors of that study, speculated was that as more and more Americans became aware of the threat from toxins because of the environmental movement, that NIMBYism, not in my backyardism, actually increased. And so it got even harder to find locations where you could put noxious facilities. And that meant that people without power maybe got targeted even more. So things haven't actually, overall things are better, right? The water is better, the air is better in general. But in terms of the inequities, those have remained. And we actually, we've even got smoking guns on this. There was a report, the Searle report in California, where the waste companies were actually describing that if you wanted to figure out where to put a new dump, they had criteria by which you were more like communities had certain characteristics that made it easier to get things located there. And so they were things like they were rural and non-English speaking, which in California means Hispanic, right? Latinx communities, that they would be low income, low education. So there was awareness of this, but it's easy to say, okay, this is just people being evil, but in fact, this is companies doing economic things, right? It's like a company's job is to make money by, if it's a waste company, having landfills, having locations where it can process waste. So then it has to figure out where to locate those. And it's just working within the framework of the regulations that exist. And then trying to find the places where there's going to be the least pushback from the community. also preferably places where the land is cheap. And that often is going to be another factor that coincides with minority communities. So it's prevalent, but it's a side effect of our industrial civilization, that we have facilities that we don't want to live next to, so we have sacrifice zones where other people have to live next to them. And the only way to change that is if we decide we're not going to use all this toxic stuff anymore.
Yeah, there's no way to really say where it is because it's everywhere. Yeah. In terms of who environmental justice is drawing into the environmental movement, I think it is bringing some life back to the environmental movement. After the 1990s, the environmental movement really kind of coasted downhill. That was, in the early 2000s, there wasn't a whole lot of youth and energy that was around the environmental movement. And what we've seen in the last, I would say, 10 years is as environmental justice has become a more core component of what environmental movements do, we've seen an expansion of the people who are interested in the work that environmental organizations do. So environmental organizations who have more awareness of environmental justice are able and being successful in attracting more diverse membership and younger membership. And you see that. I mean, it's almost a one-to-one. An environmental group that has a true to life, honest commitment to environmental justice is much more successful in expanding and maintaining some youth and vitality. And younger people, I guess it's because of the flood of information. Younger people seem to have a better ability to detect authenticity. And some of the older organizations, I don't you don't even name names, but some of the older environmental groups, just they'll talk about environmental justice, but it's clear that they don't really mean it, and they don't attract the more diverse or younger audience. So yes, it's attracting new people, but I think it's also breathing new life and purpose into environmental action.
And this is just kind of a follow-up question that I have. Is there any evidence, like specific evidence, that suggests that when the Industrial Revolution occurred, there was a significant uptick in environmental injustices? I feel like that could be an obvious yes, but I was curious if there's any evidence for that.
Well, if you're asking about evidence, there probably is, but there's none that I know of. I think the scale of the environmental problems that we faced increased as industrialization occurred, because that's when there was large scale production of steel, large scale use of resources, large scale burning of coal. So the problems just became bigger, and I think began to affect larger groups of people. I don't think it wasn't that it didn't exist before. And I don't know that it increased in any disproportionate way. It followed the increase in resource use.
That was great. Thank you for that. That was just a little bit of my own curiosity, I think. So you guys have talked a little bit about, some cases in Michigan. So I would like to ask, how has the environmental justice movement or environmental racism developed in Michigan specifically?
Well, the University of Michigan had the first conference on the subject back in 92. And it was the summary report from that conference that was actually sent to the White House, and Al Gore read it. And that's what led to Bill Clinton actually issuing an executive order on environmental justice and creating a branch of the EPA to deal with this. So Michigan is one of the first places where we have academic researchers working with activists to start providing the data and the evidence that can be used to reform our regulations and start quantifying the disparities. So in that way, we've played a real leadership role. There's a lot of the research has actually been done in the Detroit area because of the University of Michigan Dearborn and University of Michigan Ann Arbor doing research over in the Detroit area. So, but it's also been very localized to that part of the state, I think. If you look in other parts of the state, there are activist organizations, and they may be doing environmental justice work, but they may not use those terms. I mean, certainly there's been work on behalf of living conditions and working conditions for farm workers here on the west side of the state, where agriculture is such a big part of our industry. There have been issues around lead paint abatement, air quality issues, all of that goes on, but not usually with a discussion. It's not usually labeled environmental justice.
Yeah, and I think that's Michigan is among the more important states in the country for the environmental justice movement. I think that that position is not so much by a desire, is not arrived by a desire to lead on the issue, but derived by being confronted with some of the worst cases. So yes, we have been ahead of a lot of other states in coming up with some policies and legislation and practices. But if you look at those, to my knowledge, I'm sure there are exceptions, but to my knowledge, all those policies and such spring as reactions. They're not done proactively because there's a concern that a problem may exist. It's, hey, look, there's this problem we found, we better do something about it.
We do actually have an organization called the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition that brings together people from all over the state and even outside the state. And every couple of years, they have a summit where they gather people. And it's really exciting, actually, to go to these summit meetings because you have the African-American community from Detroit and the indigenous tribal representatives from the UP and up around Traverse coming together. And then the last summit I went to, we actually had members of the Menominee Nation coming over from Wisconsin. And the gathering the last time was held in Flint. And the Menominee representatives brought water from a river that they're fighting to protect in Wisconsin because there's a proposal to build a gold mine over there. And they brought it to Flint in solidarity because they saw both communities as being water protectors. And so it was this really strong sense of shared work on behalf of the planet and all of the people on the planet who rely on water and rely on air, that just transcended all of these different regions and group boundaries because of the shared experience of inequity. And that's one of the things that's been so fascinating to me about the environmental justice movement, whether in Michigan or elsewhere, is if you attend these gatherings, it's not just about like an academic conference where there's data. It's intergenerational, and it's young people expressing respect for their elders and the wisdom they have, and the elders celebrating the young people who are bringing energy and leading this movement going forward. It's this sort of healing of community. As much as it is about physical health, it's also about the healing of community. And it's just really neat to go to these gatherings, because you see how much this movement is not just about how many microns of pollution are in the air, but how much of it is about changing the ways human beings interact with each other, and how we think about the metrics for what matters, and that those are the welfare of the community as opposed to making money. So those gatherings are really powerful.
I know we could spend quite a bit of time talking about Michigan, but we do have to move into our attendee question portion. But I do have one final question for you guys. What advice do you have for the individuals tuning in today who might not be able to come next week, who want to take action, who would want to join the fight?
I would say find people who are engaged in environmental justice organizing and activism already, because it's unlikely that you're going to be the first person to a topic. There's probably already somebody else there. And if you jump into that topic, and I say this as a white male, it's one of those things that I really have to be careful of. Instead of jumping into a topic and try to fix it. And I'm kind of watching the chat. That person raised a great point. This is exactly what I'm saying. Find the people who are already leading in the community, and be there to offer your help and support. And they will know what they need help with the most.
And don't limit yourself to the phrase environmental justice, because there are people who are doing work that is all about creating an environment that is healthy and supportive of the welfare of all people in the community, who may not be using those words for it.
Thank you so much. So we'll head into some of the questions that were submitted prior. So in 5 to 10 years, how do you think the environmental justice movement will have changed, and what motivated you to be compassionate about it?
Well, I don't know. Lately, I've just been kind of a little bit more pessimistic than usual, kind of watching where things are headed. Where will the environmental justice movement be in 5 to 10 years? All I can say is where it needs to be. If it is not the focal point of every policy decision that we make in this country at every level, whether it's city, county, state, federal, if we don't say, all right, how does this highway affect environmental justice? How does this power line affect environmental justice? How does this building of more drones and aircraft carriers affect environment? If it's not at the center of every single conversation we have, then we're doomed. It's just that, because we're killing our neighbors, and they're people who don't have any opportunity to fight back. So it has to be at the center of everything.
My hope would be that there's been this movement to bring people who are experienced in social justice and experienced in environmental justice activism into the current government. And so we're going to find out whether they can actually start bringing those principles in and framing where our systems go in the future. And so 5 years from now, I will either be ready to give up or I will think that we're actually finally seeing some movement, because the right people are now being given an opportunity. But the question is, how do you get the Titanic of this, these archaic, complex governing systems to actually take the wisdom of the people and apply it, right? So Michael Regan was just confirmed as head of the EPA. He is a person with a good history of environmental justice work, and it's one reason he was nominated. The Biden administration originally wanted a woman from California, and the EJ community protested because her background was in developing California's cap and trade system, which many people in the environmental justice community feel is problematic because it allows polluters to pay to continue polluting. And if you're a fence line community, that's the last thing you want. You want the polluter shut down. So the EJ community actually lobbied to have Michael Regan instead of Mary Nichols be the person leading EPA. And that's the choice, and he's now confirmed. So we get to see what happens when it's not just a subgroup at the EPA, but the person at the top, whether that can help to move things forward. And we're also seeing people in other levels of this administration. So the social justice voice is strong here, and we now get to see what happens. And it's very important for all of us to pay attention to the opportunities that we're going to have to speak up loudly in support of the proposals they're bringing, so that we provide them with the coverage to actually take those ideas and make them into reality. So I can't say where I'll be in 5 years because I don't know what's going to happen with this, but it's the best chance we've had as long as I've been working on this.
You're still on mute, Jesse.
My bad. So this is maybe a 3 or 4 part question. I'm going to try my best to break it up. What are policy solutions that have been promoted, that have been implemented, and that have had success in terms of environmental justice and addressing environmental injustice?
Well, one of the things that we've seen is efforts to really improve decision processes. So if a company comes in and wants a permit to expand a facility or build a new facility, it used to be they'd start working with the government's helping them get their permit in order. And then after all of that's gone through, there's this public comment period, and now you can come in and say something. And that's really late in the process. So now there's more push towards actually saying, okay, environmental justice has to be something considered at the beginning of the process and has to be addressed in the permit proposal, so that it doesn't happen at the end. And that then encourages the voices of the community be consulted earlier. So we're seeing efforts to really create more participatory processes that allow for the meaningful inclusion of community voices. So that, I think, is one of the best regulatory changes we're seeing.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go as well, and it comes out of the World Bank, which is a terrible institution on every level. But they were forced to include fair or free and informed consent as part of their approval process to get new infrastructure projects built. And that particularly deals with indigenous communities around the world, and making sure that they understand exactly what the project is and what the effects of that project will be, and then getting their consent before allowing that project to be built. And that's the same kind of thing, but that's probably the biggest thing that's been positive.
Thank you. And we actually have a follow-up question to that general theme. What is the role of grassroots organizations in addressing environmental injustice? And how can we as individuals play a role in supporting these organizations?
They are the leaders. Most environmental justice movements are grassroots movements that emerge in reaction to a local threat. And so supporting them is probably the most important way to actually make a difference. Listen to what they're concerned about, and then bring your skills. GIS skills, research skills, sign making skills, letter writing skills, your physical presence at a public meeting. All of these make a difference.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. So a lot of my work is really about grassroots organizations, and so this is right now. If we look at what's happening, there is a case that's going on right now, an instance in Chicago, where there is a minority community that has had enough of being the dumping ground for industrial effluent in the area. And there's a proposal to put a metal recycling factory in their neighborhood. And they're organizing to stop it. And it's they're very well organized, and they potentially could be effective. And then, so I'm going to take this for a couple minutes, because I think this is something I want to talk about, because I think it's really the most important thing that I can stress today, and this might be a good place to fit it in. What can grassroots organizations do? Grassroots organizations are the only thing that we have that can confront the power of money and can confront the power of political advantage. So there's what Sybil said earlier about the zip code. Yes, that's correct. The generally accepted most polluted zip code in the state is in kind of South Detroit. But there was a good thesis that came out of the University of Michigan a couple of years ago, and it looked at the status of environmental justice in the state of Michigan. They did some really interesting work, and they looked at the state by census tracts. And they showed that in the census tracts of the most, so they weren't just looking at polluted, they were looking at for environmental injustice indexes. And they found the worst in the state is actually just outside of Grand Rapids. The second most environmentally unjust zip code, or sorry, census tract in the entire state of Michigan is the east side of Kalamazoo. The third most environmentally unjust census tract in the state is the north side of Kalamazoo. So the number 2 and number 3 worst cases in the entire state are right here in Kalamazoo. There's a number of factors that make those zip codes so rank so high in this scale, but the biggest one is the economic institution that sits right at the juncture of those two census tracts, and that is graphic packaging. Graphic packaging is a paper recycling factory here in the city that's gotten tens of millions of dollars of tax breaks from the city, has been cited by the states, has been dozens of times, has been sued. As a matter of fact, is being sued for racism right now, and has been the target of campaigns by people in the city for reform going back at least to the 1990s. I can't find out how far back beyond that, but at least to the 1990s. And there is not enough support for the people who are fighting against the pollution that comes from that institution here in Kalamazoo. People are working against that, but they don't have enough support from the community as a whole. And if you wanted to see what can grassroots organizations do, grassroots organizations can support the people doing that work and can say, these are the changes that need to happen, and can create the power base that can force one of the biggest money players in the city that is supported by all of the big money players, can confront them with an equally powerful force and force change to make a healthier community. That's what grassroots organizations can do.
It looks like we have a follow-up question to that from people watching on YouTube. Would we use the ongoing discussions between the city of Kalamazoo, I'm sorry if you can hear my cat, he found a marble, Would we use the ongoing discussions between the city of Kalamazoo and companies like Graphic Packaging as an example of the lack of cohesive early planning resulting in local environmental justice?
Well, one of the challenges with graphic packaging, it's always harder to stop an expansion than it is to stop something from being cited in the first place. And so in this case, the systems for preventing it weren't in place back when it got started. So the ongoing conflict is about the expansion. And just, I mean, yes, those can be stopped, but it's generally a heavier lift than it is to prevent the original siting of a facility. So that doesn't mean it can't be done, but the grassroots movement probably needs the backing from some research about the kinds of emissions and how those are affecting the community so that we can bring in the health effects of the plant are usually the one of the most important points of leverage in actually changing the perceptions of local governments.
But your question is perfectly situated, because that gets at the heart of it. Let's think of some other cases, like there was the recent issue. It's not environmental justice, but the recent issue where there was this attempt to build a gigantic car wash right, on the edge of Asylum Lake. People were able to stop it before it was built. But even so, it was a bigger effort than it should have been, because people didn't know about it until after it had passed several regulatory hurdles. So your question is right, but it also exposes the difficulty of doing this, because the only way to make that process work is to have people who are carefully attending all of the meetings for city and local or whatever level of government. And it's not just the city commission meetings, it's also the planning board meetings and the environmental concerns committee meetings. There are meetings, some kind of a city government meeting every single night of the week, and things pass through those without the public noticing. And the best time to stop a potentially damaging project is in, say, the planning board meeting before it has a whole bunch of momentum built up. So yes, it is a problem with getting appropriate public involvement at the early stages that allow some of these things to get completed that nobody other than the developer wanted in the first place.
And it's even harder now that we don't really have a gazette anymore, because that used to be where you could see these notices. Now you have to make the effort to go on the website and regularly check, is there something coming up at the planning meeting I should know about? Where it used to be you could just kind of see, is there a listing in the Gazette on Thursday, and it was part of your routine.
And from there, we can kind of talk about what resources would you advise individuals unfamiliar with this topic to utilize to educate themselves? And I take it this could even be locally or broadly as to what it even is.
Well, one thing you could do is get on the mailing list for the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, which sends out regular announcements about issues going on in the state. And they're also hiring right now. And that's a good way just to be kept informed about what's going on, and also look at their website. They've got a really wonderful program, the campaign they've been doing called Work for Me DTE, where they've been trying to prevent the DTE utility from building a new giant natural gas power plant to replace a coal-fired power plant, and instead to encouraging them to go to more renewables so that there won't be another new power plant contaminating the communities on the east side of the state. And that's also very much a climate justice issue. So that's one I like. And they have a website which also has information about stuff in Michigan. You could take Dr. Banach's history class.
Yeah, well, I mean, and Sybil's kind of point out, it's to identify one or two easy resources that will bring people up to speed is really difficult, because it's just such a complicated topic and it's just so pervasive. The problem is that it's so deeply embedded in everything that we see as normal, that it is hard to fully grasp it. So if I were to say, how does somebody get up to speed and do something productive? It's figure out what aspect of environment or justice that you are interested in, dig into that deeply, and then see how it intersects on the other side. Yeah, so I'm passionate about trees and the preservation of endangered species, but you know what? I have to recognize that people's lives are more important than the lives of trees. But without trees, we don't have people either. So how do I say, in order to save more trees, how do I help people? How do I help people and then result? So, one of the things I'm doing, I'm organizing my neighborhood and planting trees. And we're going to plant 150 trees in our neighborhood this year. That's going to help everybody's health because they take particulate matter out of the air. It's going to help everybody's health because there's lots of studies that show that's great for mental health improvement. It's going to reduce people's heating because the shade is. So all of these things are going to incur benefits to people. And that's what you have to do. How can you do something and make it relate to the other side of the equation? You have to be able to do both.
So in kind of that regard, 'cause you talked about, what your neighborhood is doing, what should WMU and Kalamazoo be doing to combat environmental racism?
I mean, one possibility is just that we start building into some of the service learning courses more connections with organizations that are doing relevant work in the community. I mean, there are groups that you might not think of as an environmental justice organization like Community Homeworks or Habitat for Humanity, but both of them are really about making housing more affordable by making it more energy efficient. And that also has the benefit of mitigating climate change, which will also harm low-income people and people of color first and hardest. So these issues all intersect, right? And then if your housing is more affordable because it's more energy efficient and the more comfortable to live in, then you've got more money left over for healthy food. You've got more money left over for trips to a park or all kinds of things that had additional benefits. So everything intersects. So one thing we can do is to think about service learning courses. Another is if we honors theses or class research projects can actually be targeted towards some of the issues around town so that we're helping to build the data set that gets used to support the efforts of grassroots communities. What information do they need? And can we help provide some of the research to help them in their legal cases, in their petitions to the local government, to facilitate their efforts? So it's not so much us determining what's going on as looking at what's going on in the community and thinking about how do we bring our resources to support those efforts that are already happening.
Yeah, I don't have a lot. What I would say is Western tries. Yeah, I will say that Western does try, does make an honest effort. But I would also say that Western would be much more effective at that if there were more organized student pressure. So, you know, what I would encourage is some kind of a group of students, whether it's an RSO or just, you know, a group of friends who say, you know, we're going to go out and talk to other RSOs, and we're going to go talk to some faculty members, and we're going to go talk to some administrators, and we're going to say environmental justice is really important to us, and this is how you can be part of the solution. So it's about capacity building. How do you get other people in other organizations to see the world in the same way you do and support your efforts?
It looks like we have one question that's a little bit different from what we've been talking about up to this point. So, are you aware of the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act? And could you educate the audience on this?
Sybil, do you want to?
So this is the CCL, the proposal, right? Most environmental justice leaders who talk about how to deal with climate change are not putting their eggs in the carbon tax or fee and dividend basket. And their concern is that the way that most of those programs are structured, they essentially, well, first of all, market forces are what have created social injustice in the first place. So the idea that somehow market forces are going to save us it's not addressing the underlying causes, and it's not addressing the social issue that is behind the climate change issue. Number one, they just don't really think that capitalism is the solution. But then the other primary issue that you will hear brought up by leaders in the EJ movement is if the polluting companies can buy credits so they have permission to keep polluting, the concern is that the most polluting plants will be the last to be cleaned up. And that means that the fence line communities will continue to suffer further into the future than they would if we tried some different kinds of policies, like putting a limit on how much pollution can be emitted, or essentially using structures to support the development of alternative energy instead. As long as, if alternative energy becomes cheaper and we switch to that, that's faster than letting polluters continue to pollute. And who's the closest to the pollution? It's the low-income communities of color. So you see a very strong, there's an organization called the Indigenous Environmental Network that has been led by Tom Goldtooth, who's a Dene and Dakota community member. And he has, through the Indigenous Environmental Network, they've actually put together an entire report on why they don't like cap and trade, and they don't see that as being a solution that addresses justice issues. Now, maybe it's possible to bring in community leaders and say, okay, can we create a cap and trade system that addresses your issues? But nobody's tried to do that. So, but it's not the first choice from the environmental justice community. They're there's no faith in capitalism, basically, if capitalism has turned a profit on your ancestors' bodies, and by disenfranchising you, by paying you poorly, by exploiting your land, by exploiting your ancestors. So, yeah.
I can't add much to the substance of that because that is spot on, but I'll do something that kind of supplements it, and that is I like that. The cap and the carbon tax system. The people who wrote it are very smart, and they put a lot of thought and a lot of work into it. So I don't blame them for fighting so hard for that as their solution today, because they've been trying so hard. The people who are fighting for this have been fighting for this for like 10, 15 years. So I respect their consistent commitment to it. The problem is, if we had implemented this system in like the late 1990s, it would have worked. It would have been enough, and we would have had this gradual transition, this gradual change, and we wouldn't have really had to really deeply alter what we're doing. But we've passed the point where that will work in the situation that we have. It won't create the justice results, and it won't create the climate results that we're going after without dramatic restructuring of so many aspects of our lives. So I think it's unfortunate that that was a solution that could have worked and could have been easily implemented 30 years ago. It's just not enough for us today.
Thank you for that. So we're going to go into the questions that have been asked while we've been talking. This question says, Dr. Benak touched on this a bit, but has there been any overlap between the environmental racism movement, the environmental justice movement, and the ecofeminism movement? And has the US seen any overlap of gender, race, and the environment?
Yes, in that a lot of the environmental justice theory and practice actually comes from ecofeminism. Ecofeminism was, a going concern or a philosophy practiced by lots of people before environmental justice became a common topic in the movement. So there's deeper roots there, very, very deep theoretical roots as well. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier, is that environmental organizations and movements that are able to embrace a more diverse gender, a more diverse racial, a more diverse age have had much more success. And I think that that's where the interplay has, and honestly, I don't think we would be where we are in environmental justice if we had not had the strong ecofeminism movement pushing us in the late 1980s. That changed the way a lot of environmental organizations functioned. And I think it made it possible for environmental justice to get to the top of our list of concerns today.
I would also point out that women often bear the brunt of environmental inequities because so many of them have health consequences, and women tend to be the primary caregivers for children and spouses and elders who have health problems that are caused by environmental pollution. So women are often very aware of the dangers of the environmental contaminants around them and are very well represented in leadership in the environmental justice movements, which may also explain why environmental justice organizations tend to be very horizontal in their organization, very consensus-based and collaborative rather than hierarchical, which could also be an influence of the number of women who are active in this field.
Thank you for that. I did not know much about that. So here's another question. With the constant change in governmental leadership, how do we make real progress in policy?
I'd go back to what we've been saying before. It's creating grassroots organizations that have some longevity. Somebody pointed out to me a few years ago that just in Kalamazoo, in just the last few years, we've had a number of environmental organizations spring up and make a big splash on the scene, and then 2 years later, they're nowhere to be seen. And that's the reason I think that grassroots movements fail. That's the reason that it's so hard for people to influence politics on a significant level, is because you get a good core group, and then when they move out of your organization, the transition to the next leadership core, you fall apart. So It's creating strong organizations, but finding a way to create some sense of continuity to keep the group going.
And I think it also helps to, this is an improving curve. I mean, it goes up at plateaus, it goes up at plateaus. So what we see is once you get a policy in place, it rarely gets set aside. It may not be enforced very actively for a while, but once it's there, it's there. And then the next administration that has to respond to an issue says, oh, this is here, we can use this. And then you get sort of your next step up and step up. So we've been making gradual progress in terms of establishing better policies and regulations, and sort of a stop and start on implementation. So even a short-lived group can maybe get the policy in place, but it would be even better if you've got a group with some longevity to encourage implementation.
That's why it's really interesting that you guys have been talking about young people's increasing involvement. Hopefully that adds some of the continuity that you're talking about in these movements. So we have one more question before we can close up. If race and socioeconomic status shouldn't play a role in where environmental bad things should be placed, how should we figure out where to put these things?
Well, I would say if they are a bad thing that no one wants around them, then we have to make real difficult decisions as to whether or not that is a necessary thing. Because a lot of these bad things, whether it's some kind of a factory that creates too much pollution, a pipeline, a unhealthy whatever, an unhealthy environment of any type, those things are there's alternatives. Sybil talked about, so replacing a coal-fired power plant with a natural gas-fired power plant. So we're told that you should be happy and accept that because that's better than the one that's gone. Well, no, that doesn't make it okay. If it's not good enough to have near my house, then maybe we don't need it. And I think we have to confront that, and we have to say that if that's the case, then we don't need it. And otherwise, we need to find a way that every community is equally impacted by these decisions.
There are cases where, so I think it was in Ontario, Canada, they needed a new waste facility, and they really did a participatory process where they basically stressed, we all create waste. Everyone in this province creates waste. So we all have an obligation to figure out how to handle this waste. And then talk to communities about what would be the trade-offs and benefits and what was the state-of-the-art technology. And it was a good enough process that it got to where a few communities applied to have that, and the community members were part of the process. And the siting was actually done with the cooperation of the community, to the point where it actually became sort of the state-of-the-art facility, and people would make tours of the facility, and tourists would come to the province to see the facility. And so one part of the solution is, if we're going to produce things, can we actually have a participatory process that is fair, that is a just process, so that it's not one group foisting stuff on another, but people saying, yes, we will step up and accept that we're going to help with this issue, but then that's it for our community. Somebody else has got to do the next issue. And like David says, actually have some equitable distribution of where stuff ends up.
Well, that was great. Thank you again. So I want to thank both of you, our lovely panelists, for taking the time today to share this collaborative space and talking about this and really establishing the background and what this movement is for everybody that tuned in. I also want to thank everybody who watched, from YouTube, students, community members, all of you. Thank you for engaging and participating with this conversation. If any of your friends or constituents missed today's conversation, that's okay. We have another event going on next week, a second panel discussion expanding on environmental racism and how we can take action within our own community. And we're also going to look specifically at Kalamazoo as well. Please feel free to reach out for more information regarding environmental justice and the topics discussed today. And please tune in next Thursday for a conversation. And don't forget to fill out the attendance link that Taylor put in the chat to ensure you receive credit. So again, thank you all for making today's event a great one, and we appreciate you taking the time to learn more about the realities that marginalized communities in our country face.